The silver spoon hit the fine china edge of the teacup with a sharp, piercing ring. It was a tiny sound, yet in the sprawling dining room of the Sterling estate, it echoed like a gunshot. Eleanor Sterling did not look away from the window. Outside, the early autumn rain was turning the manicured lawns into a blurry wash of green and gray. She liked the rain. It was honest. It didn't pretend to be warm or comforting. It simply fell. Across the mahogany table, her husband Julian was reading the morning Financial Times, his sharp profile illuminated by the pale morning light. Julian always read the paper with the same intensity he applied to dismantling rival corporations. He was a man of absolute control, from the perfect knot of his silk tie to the measured, calm rhythm of his breathing. But it wasn't Julian who had dropped the spoon. It was Chloe. Eleanor's younger sister sat at the end of the table, her hands resting flat against the pristine white tablecloth. Chloe's face was uncharacteristically pale, stripped of her usual vibrant blush and practiced smiles. She stared directly at Julianne, bypassing Eleanor entirely. "I'm pregnant," Chloe said. The words did not stumble out. They were delivered with a chilling clinical precision. Rehearsed, Eleanor's mind registered automatically. She had spent the last 28 years translating Chloe's behaviors. A spontaneous Chloe was loud, dramatic, and tearful. A rehearsed Chloe was quiet, steady, and infinitely more dangerous. Julian stopped reading. He did not immediately lower the newspaper. For a fraction of a second, the room suspended in a vacuum of silence. Then slowly, he folded the paper and set it aside. His steely gray-blue eyes locked onto Chloe. "Excuse me?" Julian's voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. "I am carrying your child, Julian." Chloe repeated, her voice rising just enough to catch the acoustics of the vaulted ceiling. "From the night of the charity gala, April 12th, when you asked me into your private study after midnight." Eleanor felt the breath leave her lungs. It didn't rush out in a gasp, it simply evaporated, leaving her chest tight and hollow. She slowly turned her head to look at her husband. She expected to see anger. She expected to see the cold, calculating fury of a man being blackmailed. Julian Sterling was a man who destroyed liars for sport. But what she saw in his face was not anger. It was shock. Pure, unadulterated shock. His jaw tightened, and his hand resting on the table flinched just a millimeter, but enough for Eleanor to see it. It was the face of a man who had been struck blindly in the dark. It was not the face of a man who was completely innocent of the setting, even if he was innocent of the crime. He had been with her in the study after midnight. "Chloe, what kind of sick game is this?" Julian finally spoke, his voice cracking like breaking ice. "It's not a game," Chloe whispered, allowing a single perfect tear to trace its way down her cheek. "I'm 8 weeks along. The doctor confirmed it yesterday. I was terrified. I didn't want to hurt Eleanor, but the baby needs its father." Eleanor sat perfectly still. Underneath the table, her right hand instinctively moved to rest over her own lower abdomen. Her stomach was completely flat beneath her tailored wool skirt. Just yesterday, she had visited Dr. Evans. Just yesterday, she had heard the rapid, fluttery sound of a tiny heartbeat. 7 weeks. She had planned to tell Julian tonight. She had bought a tiny pair of silver baby shoes and wrapped them in a velvet box. She had imagined the way his strict, formal expression would melt into that rare, devastating smile he reserved only for her. She had spent the entire night wide awake, floating on a sea of quiet, fierce joy. Now that joy turned to ash in her throat. "You were in my study because you claimed you were having a panic attack," Julian said, his voice dropping into a lethal quiet register. He stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the table. "You asked for a glass of water. I gave it to you. I called my driver to take you home. That was the entirety of our interaction. Is that what you're going to tell her?" Chloe looked at Eleanor with wide, tragic eyes. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I tried to push him away, but you know how he is. He gets whatever he wants." Eleanor looked at the two of them, her husband, her sister, the two people who tethered her to this world. She remembered the night of April 12th clearly. Julian had come to bed late, smelling faintly of scotch and rain. He hadn't touched her. He had simply turned his back and fallen into a restless sleep. When she had asked him the next morning why he looked so exhausted, he had brushed it off as work stress. He hadn't told her Chloe was there. He had kept a secret. And in the world of the Sterlings, a secret was merely a lie waiting to hatch. "Eleanor," Julian said, turning to her,
His eyes were wide, pleading. The absolute panic in his gaze was real. You know this is insane. Tell her to leave. Better yet, I'll have security remove her.
Eleanor looked down at her own hand, still resting invisibly over the secret life growing inside her. If she stayed, she would have to fight. She would have to drag her sister to a doctor-demand blood test, hire investigators. She would have to subject the tiny, fragile life inside her to a war zone of corporate sabotage and family betrayal. She had grown up fighting for scraps of affection while Chloe took the spotlight. She was tired. She was so unbelievably tired. And the thought of fighting for her husband's innocence when he hadn't even respected her enough to tell her the truth about that night made her physically sick. A fierce protective instinct flared to life in her chest. It had nothing to do with Julian and everything to do with the child she carried. Her true heir. Eleanor stood up. Her chair scraped against the hardwood floor, a harsh sound that made both Julian and Chloe flinch.
Eleanor. Julian stepped toward her, reaching out a hand.
She took a step back, her eyes cold and clear. Do not touch me. Julian froze, his hand suspended in midair. Ayla, he whispered, using the private nickname that usually made her heart soften. Please, you can't possibly believe her. I believe, Eleanor said, her voice eerily calm, that my sister was in your private study at 1 a.m. and you decided I didn't need to know about it. I was protecting you from her dramatics. Julian argued, desperation bleeding into his tone. You don't protect someone by blinding them, Julian, Eleanor replied. She looked at Chloe, who was watching the scene with a poorly concealed glimmer of triumph. If the child is yours, provide for it. If it isn't, destroy her. But do it without me. She turned and walked out of the dining room. The master suite of the Sterling estate was a sprawling expanse of silver gray silk and dark mahogany, a room designed for magazine spreads rather than human comfort. Eleanor bypassed the massive walk-in closet that housed tens of thousands of dollars in designer gowns. Instead, she went straight for the vintage leather duffel bag she had brought with her on their honeymoon, a relic from her life before she became Mrs. Julian Sterling. She moved with an eerie mechanical efficiency. Sweaters, jeans, flat shoes, the comfortable invisible armor of a woman who was no longer playing a part. Her hands were completely steady as she folded a gray cashmere cardigan, but beneath her ribs, her heart was beating a frantic bruising rhythm against her sternum. 1, 2, 3. She counted the beats, forcing herself to breathe deeply. Dr. Evans had warned her to avoid extreme stress. Extreme stress, Eleanor thought, with a bitter internal laugh. My sister just claimed she is carrying my husband's child. I suppose that qualifies. The heavy oak door pushed open. Julian stood in the doorway. The flawless armor of the Sterling CEO was fracturing. He had ripped his silk tie off the top. 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone, and his dark hair, usually meticulously styled, was pushed back in disarray. He looked wild. He looked entirely unlike the man she had married. You are not packing, Julian said. It wasn't a request, it was an executive order delivered in the low, gravelly tone that made board members tremble. Eleanor did not look up. She zipped the first compartment of the duffel bag. I am leaving, Julian. You can have the driver take me to the city or I will call a cab. It makes no difference to me. He crossed the massive room in 3 long strides, his large hand clamping over her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to stop her movements. The warmth of his skin sent a familiar, agonizing jolt through her system.
Look at me, Julian demanded, his voice thick with a desperate kind of anger. Eleanor, look at me.
She raised her eyes. They were a cool, clear hazel, stripped of the warmth that usually greeted him. I did not touch her, Julian said, enunciating every single syllable as if his life depended on it. His chest heaved with uneven breaths. I swear to you on my life, on my father's grave, on everything I have built. I did not touch your sister.
I know.
The 2 words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Julian's grip on her wrist loosened, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. You know. I know you didn't sleep with her, Eleanor said softly, pulling her wrist free. She turned back to the bed, picking up a small stack of cotton shirts. You have too much pride to sleep with a woman who throws herself at you so desperately. And you are too calculated to risk a scandal with your own sister-in-law. Then why are you packing? Julian ran a hand over his face, a raw sound of frustration tearing from his throat. If you know it's a lie, why are you walking away? We fight this. We call my lawyers. We drag her to a clinic and demand a paternity test. We crush this right now. Eleanor stopped. She looked at the man she loved, and she did love him with a deep, aching permanence that made this moment infinitely worse. Because you gave her the weapon, Julian B. Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You let her into your study at 1 in the morning, and then you looked me in the eye the next day at breakfast and you said nothing. You kept a secret. You built the shadow that she is now using to hide her lies. I was managing a problem? He fired back, stepping closer, his imposing frame practically vibrating with tension. She was hysterical. If I told you, you would have been upset. You would have tried to coddle her, and it would have become a massive dramatic event. I handled it. I sent her away. You handled it? Eleanor repeated, a sad, hollow smile touching her lips. Because you handle everything. The company, the estate, and me. You decided I couldn't handle the truth about my own sister. She placed a protective hand flat against her stomach. The gesture was subtle, entirely missed by the frantic man pacing before her. He handles everything alone, she thought. If I tell him I am carrying his heir right now, he won't see it as a miracle. He will see it as another asset, to protect another variable to manage in his war against Chloe. My child will become a pawn in a sterling scandal. She would not allow it. Her child would not be born into a war zone of paranoia and DNA tests. Eleanor, please. Julian's voice broke. The sound was so rare, so incredibly vulnerable, that it almost shattered her resolve. He reached out his fingers, lightly brushing her cheek. Don't walk out that door. I need you. I cannot do this without you. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting herself feel the warmth of his hand for one final second. Then she stepped back. She reached for her left hand. Slowly, deliberately, she slid the massive, flawless sterling diamond off her ring finger. The metal felt heavy. She placed it gently on the polished surface of the mahogany dresser. The soft clink sounded like a lock snapping shut. Julian stared at the ring, all the color draining from his face. His jaw slackened. No, no, Eli, don't do this. Fix your mess, Julian, she whispered, picking up the heavy leather duffel bag. Find out whose child she is really carrying. Find out who told her to use your name. Win your war, but you will do it alone. She walked past him. Julian stood paralyzed, staring at the ring on the dresser as if it were a venomous snake. The shock of her actual departure was a physical blow he hadn't prepared for. He was a man who anticipated every market crash, every hostile takeover, but he had never anticipated a world where Eleanor simply stopped fighting for him. The hallway was long and silent. As Eleanor descended the grand, sweeping staircase, she saw Chloe standing near the foyer. Her arms crossed, a nervous but triumphant gleam in her eyes.
We're running away, Elle, Chloe asked, her voice echoing in the marble entryway. I suppose it's for the best. He deserves a mother for his child.
Eleanor paused at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at her sister, really looked at her. She saw the fear hiding beneath the smugness. Chloe was playing a game far too dangerous for her intellect, and someone else was surely pulling the strings.
A piece of advice, Chloe. Eleanor said, her voice cold and devoid of any sisterly affection. Julian does not forgive. When he finds out the truth, and he will ruin you. And I will not be here to talk him out of it.
Chloe's triumphant smile faltered, her face paling slightly. Eleanor didn't wait for a response. She pushed open the heavy oak front doors and stepped out into the freezing autumn rain. The estate's head driver, Thomas, rushed forward with an umbrella, looking distressed. Ma'am, should I bring the car around? No, Thomas, thank you. I've called a taxi. She stood in the driveway as the yellow cab pulled up the tires, hissing on the wet asphalt. Before she climbed in, she glanced up at the master bedroom window. Julian was standing there, a dark silhouette against the warm light of the room, watching her go. Even from this distance, she could feel the weight of his devastation. She slid into the back seat, giving the driver an address to a small, obscure hotel across the city. As the cab pulled away from the iron gates of the Sterling estate, Eleanor placed both hands firmly over her stomach. The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, hot and silent, in the dark car.
It's just you and me now, little one, she whispered into the empty space. I will keep you safe, no matter what it takes.
The radiator in the small second-floor Seattle apartment hissed a rhythmic metallic sound that Eleanor had learned to tune out over the last 3 years. Outside the Pacific Northwest, rain drummed a relentless beat against the thin glass. It was 3 in the morning and the world was bathed in a bruised indigo darkness. Eleanor sat at a small scuffed wooden dining table, rubbing her tired eyes. Spread out before her were client ledgers, tax forms, and a calculator. She had rebuilt her life from scratch, taking on freelance accounting work for small local businesses. It was a far cry from the glittering charity galas and corporate boardrooms of New York, and her bank accounts was a fraction of what it had once been. But as she took a sip of her lukewarm, bitter coffee, she felt a profound sense of peace. The air in this cramped apartment was clean. There were no lies hidden in the shadows here. A soft rustling sound came from the bedroom. Eleanor immediately pushed the ledges aside and stood up, her bare feet padding softly across the worn carpet. She pushed the door open to see her son sitting up in his toddler bed, clutching a worn stuffed bear. Mama, Leo rubbed his eyes, his voice thick with sleep. I'm here, sweetheart, Eleanor whispered, crossing the room and sinking onto the edge of his bed. She brushed a lock of dark hair from his forehead. At 2.5 years old, Leo was a walking, breathing ghost of the man she had left behind. The resemblance was no longer just a mother's imagination. It was an undeniable, striking reality. He had Julian's thick, impossibly dark hair that refused to lay flat. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from Eleanor's lungs every single day. They were not her warm hazel. They were the exact piercing gray blue of a stormy ocean, the sterling eyes. Even his demeanor was heartbreakingly familiar. Leo rarely threw typical toddler tantrums. Instead, when he was displeased, his tiny brow would furrow into a serious calculating line, a micro-expression that belonged entirely to the CEO of Sterling Holdings. Water, Leo demanded softly, not whining, just stating a fact.
Let's get you some water, Eleanor said, lifting him into her arms. He felt heavy, solid, and wonderfully warm against her chest. As she adjusted him on her hip, her fingers brushed the nape of his neck.
Right there, hidden beneath the collar of his cotton pajamas, was a small crescent-shaped birthmark. Eleanor had seen that exact same mark 1,000 times, traced it with her own fingers in the dark of the Sterling master bedroom. It was a genetic stamp, an unbroken chain of Sterling heritage. He is your true heir. Julian, she thought, pouring a small cup of water for the boy in the dim light of the kitchen. He is brilliant, and he is perfect, and he is mine. She didn't regret leaving. She knew that if she had stayed, Leo would have been born into a toxic war of DNA tests, press leaks, and corporate maneuvering. He would have been a pawn. Here in this tiny apartment smelling of cheap coffee and baby lotion, Leo was just a boy who was loved beyond measure. But sometimes, in the quiet, agonizing hours of the night, Eleanor allowed herself to miss her husband. She missed the heavy, protective weight of his arm across her waist. She missed the rare, quiet moments when the ruthless CEO vanished, leaving only the man who loved her. 3 time zones away in a penthouse overlooking the glittering, jagged skyline of Manhattan, Julian Sterling was also awake. He did not sleep much anymore. 3 years ago, when Eleanor walked out the door, she had taken the light, the warmth, and the very concept of rest with her. Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of amber scotch resting untouched in his hand. The penthouse was immaculate, designed by top-tier professionals, and utterly devoid of life. It was a museum of wealth. On the massive mahogany desk behind him sat a single flawless diamond ring. It had remained exactly where she had left it.
The private elevator chimed, breaking the suffocating silence. Julian didn't turn around. He already knew who it was, and the familiar knot of cold resentment tightened in his chest. Chloe stepped into the penthouse, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She was dressed in a pristine white Chanel suit, adorned with diamonds that Julian's accountants paid for every month.
Julian, Chloe said, her voice dripping with a practiced breathy sweetness. You didn't answer my calls. Again. It's 5 in the morning. Chloe. Julian said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. He finally turned to face her, his gray blue eyes dark and hostile. My office hours begin at 8. If you have an issue with your allowance, contact legal.
Chloe's perfect smile faltered. She crossed her arms, her manicured nails digging into the white fabric of her jacket. I am not one of your employees. I am the mother of your son. Finn is turning 3 next month. I want to host a party at the Hamptons estate, and I expect you to be there.
Julian looked at her with a gaze so chilling it could have frozen the scotch in his glass.
3 years ago, Chloe had presented a DNA test from a clinic she had selected, proving the child was his. Trapped by the media scandal she had ruthlessly orchestrated and shattered by Eleanor's departure, Julian had done what he did best. He managed the liability. He bought Chloe a luxury townhouse. He set up a multi-million-dollar trust for the boy Finn. He paid every exorbitant bill she forwarded to his office.
But he had never married her. He had never once touched her. And to Chloe's enduring fury, he almost never looked at the child.
You can have the party wherever you like, Julian said quietly. My assistant will ensure the catering is handled. I will not be attending.
He asked about you. Chloe's voice rose, a shrill, desperate note creeping into her tone. He is a sterling. He needs his father, Julian. You can't just throw money at us and pretend we don't exist. Julian took a slow, measured step toward her. The air in the room seemed to drop them 10 degrees. Chloe instinctively took a step back, her bravado crumbling.
Let us be absolutely clear, Julian murmured, his voice a lethal weapon. I provide for you because a piece of paper says I have to. I fund your lifestyle to keep your mouth shut in the press. But do not ever mistake a financial transaction for a family.
You are so cold, Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hatred. She left you, Julian. Eleanor abandoned you. I stayed. I gave you a son. Julian's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle ticked in his cheek. The mention of Eleanor's name in Chloe's mouth felt like a physical violation. Get out, he commanded softly.
Chloe swallowed hard, realizing she had pushed too far. She turned on her heel and fled toward the elevator, the heavy door sliding shut behind her, leaving Julian alone in his immaculate silent cage.
He walked back to the desk and picked up the diamond ring. He remembered the day he had placed it on Eleanor's finger. He remembered the warmth of her smile, the absolute unwavering trust in her hazel eyes, a trust he had broken with his silence. He looked down at the ring, the crushing weight of his regret threatening to pull him under. He had a vast empire, billions in assets, and a child carrying his name just 10 blocks away. Yet as he stood in the cold morning light of New York, Julian Sterling had never felt more completely, utterly empty. The Sterling Foundation's annual charity gala was a glittering display of Manhattan's elite, a sea of bespoke tuxedos, silk gowns, and suffocating hypocrisy. For Julian, it was an obligatory performance. He stood near the grand staircase of the Plaza Hotel, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, his expression an impenetrable mask of polite indifference.
He hated this event. Eleanor had always been the soul of the foundation. She used to navigate these ballrooms with a genuine radiant warmth that made billionaires and politicians alike feel seen. Without her, the gala was just another soulless corporate transaction.
Julian Darling looked who wanted to say hello. Julian stiffened. He didn't need to turn to recognize the cloying, performative tone of Chloe's voice. He slowly pivoted, bracing himself for the flash of the paparazzi cameras that always seemed to magically appear whenever Chloe approached him in public. She was holding Finn's hand. The 3-year-old boy was dressed in a miniature velvet tuxedo that looked stiff and uncomfortable. Julian looked down at the boy. For 3 years, Julian had actively avoided looking closely at Finn. The child was a living, breathing monument to the destruction of his marriage. But tonight, forced into proximity by the watchful eyes of the press, Julian truly looked. Finn was a handsome child, but as Julian stared into the boy's face, a strange, cold prickle of unease washed over him. Genetics in the Sterling family were notoriously dominant. Julian's father, his grandfather, and Julian himself all shared the exact same striking features: pitch black hair, a sharp, angular jawline, and those distinct, piercing gray-blue eyes. Even Eleanor's family had strong traits: hazel eyes and rich chestnut hair. Finn had none of it. The boy had fine, sandy blonde hair and wide, pale blue eyes. His bone structure was soft, lacking any hint of the Sterling edge.
He doesn't look like me. Julian thought, the realization hitting him, not with anger, but with the cold, precise logic of a man analyzing a mismatched balance sheet. He doesn't look like Eleanor's side of the family either. Say hello to your father, Finn, Chloe coaxed, nudging the boy forward.
Finn looked up at Julian, shrinking back slightly. There was no connection between them, no spark of recognition. Just a stranger looking at another stranger.
He's been so excited to see you. Chloe continued her smile entirely for the benefit of the society photographer hovering 10 feet away. Though he's a bit tired. You know how it is. Being a preemie, his immune system is still catching up sometimes. He had that terrible cold last week.
Julian's eyes snapped from the boy to Chloe. The ambient noise of the ballroom seemed to instantly drop to a muted hum.
A preemie, Julian repeated. His voice was soft, but it carried a sudden lethal weight. Chloe blinked her smile, faltering for a fraction of a second. Well, yes, he came a few weeks early. The doctor said it was the stress of, well, of the separation.
Julian's mind was a steel trap, and Chloe had just stepped onto the trigger. He remembered the paperwork his corporate lawyers had processed 3 years ago, the birth certificate. Finn was born on December 10th. If Chloe had truly gotten pregnant on the night of the charity gala, April 12th, a December 10th birth meant the child was carried for nearly 35 weeks. That wasn't a severe premature birth. That was barely early. Yet Chloe had just claimed his immune system was compromised because he was a preemie. Furthermore, Julian recalled the hospital record she had submitted to the trust fund. Finn had weighed over 8 pounds at birth. An 8-pound premature baby. The math did not add up. The timeline was fractured. The genetics were entirely absent. Julian had been so blinded by Eleanor walking out so crippled by the grief of losing his wife that he had handed the entire scandal over to his legal team to bury. He had trusted a DNA test from a private clinic. Chloe had chosen a clinic she claimed made her feel comfortable during a traumatic time. He had stopped thinking like a CEO and started reacting like a broken man.
Until tonight. Is that so? Julian said, his voice returning to its smooth, detached cadence. He reached down and smoothly took the small, half empty crystal glass of apple juice from Finn's hand. Allow me. The glass is too heavy for him.
Before Chloe could object, Julian turned to a passing waiter, placing his own water glass on the tray, but keeping his firm grip on Finn's juice glass.
Enjoy the gala, Chloe. Julian said, his eyes locking onto hers with a chilling, predatory focus. I have urgent business to attend to.
He didn't wait for her response. He walked purposefully through the crowded ballroom, bypassing the elite guests who tried to catch his eye, heading straight for the private security elevators.
10 minutes later, Julian was standing in the soundproof basement office of Marcus Vance, the head of Sterling Holdings Global Security Intelligence. Marcus was a former intelligence officer, ruthless, discreet, and fiercely loyal only to Julian, not to the corporate board.
Julian placed the small crystal glass, still bearing Finn's fingerprints and saliva, into a sterile plastic evidence bag. He slid it across the heavy metal desk.
I need a full genomic sequence. Julian commanded, his voice vibrating with a dark, suppressed fury. Not a standard paternity test, a full sequence. I want it run through an independent offshore lab. No one in this building, and certainly no one on my legal team, is to know about this.
Marcus looked at the bag, then up at his boss. He had worked for Julian for 10 years and had never seen him look like this. The hollow, dead-eyed executive of the past 3 years was gone. The man standing before him was a predator who had just picked up a scent. Understood, Marcus said. What else? 3 years ago, Chloe Vance submitted a DNA test from the Kensington private clinic, verifying my paternity. Julian continued pacing the length of the small office. I want that clinic ripped apart. I want the names of the doctors, the lab technicians, the financial backers. I want to know who funded her, who coached her, and who falsified those results. Julian stopped, placing both hands flat on Marcus's desk, leaning in. Someone built this lie, Marcus. Someone used my wife's sister to destroy my marriage, and I'm going to burn their entire life to the ground. I'll have a preliminary report on the clinic within 48 hours. Marcus promised, sliding the plastic bag into a secure drawer. And the DNA results. Expedite them, Julian said, his eyes cold and hard as diamonds. I want to know exactly whose child she is parading around under my name. As Julian took the private elevator back up to the penthouse, the crushing weight of the past 3 years seemed to shift, replaced by a burning singular focus. If Chloe had lied about the child, then she had lied about that night, which meant Eleanor had walked away for nothing. The thought felt like a blade twisting in his gut. I will find the truth, Julian bowed silently to the empty elevator car. And then, LA, I am going to find you. The manila folder sitting on the center of Julian's massive glass desk seemed to absorb all the light in the room. It was painfully thin. $1 billion empire, a shattered marriage, and 3 years of suffocating isolation, all reduced to 5 pages of genomic sequencing and financial routing numbers. Marcus stood on the other side of the desk, his hands clasped behind his back, looking like a soldier reporting casualties. 0% probability. Julian read aloud, his voice dangerously calm. The silence in the executive office was absolute, save for the faint hum of the city 70 floors below. 0, sir, Marcus confirmed. The boy shares absolutely no genetic markers with the Sterling lineage. Julian closed the file. He didn't feel relief. He felt a cold, expanding void opening in his chest. And the clinic?
Kensington Private Clinic was facing bankruptcy 4 years ago. Marcus explained, stepping forward to slide a second, thicker file across the glass. 6 months before your charity gala, they received a massive influx of capital through an offshore shell company. The shell company is registered in the Cayman Islands, but we tracked the IP addresses and authorization signatures back to a server in Chicago.
Julian's eyes narrowed. Thorn Industries.
Richard Thorne. Marcus nodded. 3 years ago, you and Thorne were in a dead heat for the European infrastructure contract. It was a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. You had the edge. Thorne needed a scandal to tank Sterling Holdings' stock price and distract you from the final negotiations. He found a vulnerability. He found my wife's sister, Julian said softly, the puzzle pieces snapping together with sickening clarity.
We pulled Chloe Vance's private banking records. The day after Eleanor left you, a deposit of $2 million was made into an account under Chloe's name. The payments have continued quarterly. Thorne bought her Julian. He paid her to seduce you, and when you didn't take the bait, he paid her to fake the pregnancy timeline and falsify the DNA test at the clinic he owned. Julian stood up, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked out over the Manhattan skyline. Richard Thorne. The man he had beaten in the boardroom had resorted to destroying Julian's home. But Thorne was just a parasite. He had only exploited an existing rot.
I gave him the weapon. Eleanor's voice echoed in Julian's memory, a ghost haunting his every waking moment. You led her into your study at 1 a.m, and then you said nothing.
Eleanor had been right. If Julian had simply been honest, if he had trusted his wife instead of trying to manage the situation like a corporate liability, Thorne's plan would have failed instantly. His arrogance had cost him the only woman he had ever loved.
Sir, how do you want to handle Thorne? Marcus asked quietly.
I'm going to dismantle Thorne Industries piece by piece until Richard Thorne is begging for bankruptcy, Julian said, his voice dropping to a glacial whisper. But first, send her in. Julian didn't need to specify who. He walked back to his desk and sat down, his posture, rigid as face, an impenetrable mask of stone.
2 minutes later, the heavy oak doors opened. Chloe walked in, carrying a designer handbag and wearing a look of rehearsed annoyance.
Julian really summoning me to the office like an employee I had a fitting at Bergdorf's. Au proud, she complained, sinking into one of the leather chairs opposite his desk. She crossed her legs, looking around the sterile office. Though I suppose it's about time we discuss upgrading my townhouse. Finn needs a bigger yard. Julian stared at her. He let the silence stretch. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Chloe's confident posture began to wilt under the sheer crushing weight of his gaze. She uncrossed her legs, her smile faltering. Julian, what is it? Julian slid the thin manila folder across the glass desk. I ran a full genomic sequence on Finn, Julian said. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The quietness of it was terrifying. Chloe's face drained of all color, turning a sickly translucent white. Her breath hitched, and for a second Julian thought she might actually faint. Her eyes darted to the folder, but she didn't touch it. She pulled her hands back as if the paper were engulfed in flames. You can't do that, she stammered, her voice shaking violently. We already did a test at Kensington. It's final.
Kensington is owned by Richard Thorne, Julian stated, watching her flinch at the name. The same Richard Thorne who has been depositing millions into your offshore accounts for the past 3 years. The same Richard Thorne who needed me distracted so he could steal the European contracts.
No, Julian, please, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Julian cut her off, his tone razor sharp. You slept with some nameless, nobody, got pregnant and realized you were going to lose your comfortable, glamorous life. Thorne approached you. He fed your jealousy of your sister. He offered you money and a script, and you played your part flawlessly. Chloe burst into tears.
It wasn't the pretty practice crying she usually employed. This was the ugly, hyperventilating panic of a cornered animal.
I'm sorry, she sobbed, pressing her hands to her face. He promised me I'd be taken care of. I was so jealous of her, Julian. She had everything she had. You, the wealth, the respect, I just wanted a piece of it. Thorne said if I did it, you would eventually marry me to save face. He said Eleanor would run. Julian felt a surge of physical nausea. She had traded her own sister's happiness for a townhouse and a lie. You are going to take your son, and you are going to leave the townhouse by midnight tonight. Julian ordered, his voice devoid of any mercy. I am freezing the trust. I am freezing your accounts. My lawyers will be filing fraud and extortion charges against both you and Richard Thorne before the banks open tomorrow. Julian, please. Finn is just a little boy. You've been his father for 3 years. You can't just throw us on the street. Chloe begged, dropping to her knees on the expensive Persian rug. I am not his father, Julian said coldly. Take Thorne's money. Take whatever you can carry. But if I ever see your face in this city again, I will ensure you spend the next 2 decades in federal prison for corporate espionage and wire fraud. Get out of my sight.
Chloe looked up at him, her mascara running down her pale cheeks, realizing there was no manipulation left to play. She was looking at a machine, a man who had finally been pushed past the point of human sympathy. Trembling, she scrambled to her feet and ran out of the office, her sobs echoing down the hallway.
Julian sat alone in the silence. He had won. The lie was exposed, the enemy was identified, and the parasite had been excised.
But as he looked at the empty chair where Chloe had sat, he didn't feel victorious. He felt the gaping, bleeding hole where his wife used to be.
He pressed a button on his intercom. Marcus.
Yes, sir. Liquidate my calendar. Cancel all board meetings. Julian commanded, his voice breaking just a fraction, betraying the desperate beating heart beneath the armor. Put every single operative, every private investigator, and every digital analyst we have on a single target. Who is the target, Mr. Sterling?
My wife. Find Eleanor. I don't care how much it costs or how long it takes. Find her. For 3 weeks, Julian Sterling lived as a ghost haunting his own empire. He didn't sleep. He barely ate. The executive board of Sterling Holdings operated in a state of quiet terror, watching their ruthless, impeccably controlled CEO transform into a man driven by a dangerous singular obsession. Finding Eleanor Vance was supposed to be easy. In Julian's world, everyone left a digital footprint. Credit cards, passport scans, luxury hotel reservations, private medical insurance, wealth always left a trail. But Marcus's elite security team kept hitting dead ends. She's off the grid, Julian, Marcus had reported after the first agonizing week, dropping a thin, useless dossier onto the desk. She hasn't touched the emergency funds you set up. She hasn't contacted any of her old university friends. She is living strictly on cash, or she has assumed an alias so unremarkable that it slips through our algorithms. She doesn't want to be found. Find her anyway, Julian had replied, his voice rough and ragged. The breakthrough didn't come from a private investigator or a satellite trace. It came from a microscopic anomaly in a municipal tax database. Eleanor had been a brilliant accountant before she married Julianne, possessing a rare, almost architectural mind for numbers. During her time at Sterling Holdings, she had designed a highly specific proprietary macro formula to streamline the company's charitable tax deductions. It was a digital fingerprint unique entirely to her. Late on a Tuesday night, one of Marcus's data analysts flagged a hit. A small independent bakery in a rainy working-class suburb of Seattle had filed its quarterly taxes using that exact proprietary formula. The filing was signed by an independent contractor, E. Vance.
12 hours later, Julian's private jet touched down in Seattle.
The Pacific Northwest greeted him with a relentless driving rain that felt like a cruel echo of the morning she had walked out of his life. Julian didn't wait for his security detail to arrange a discreet perimeter. He ordered his driver to take him straight to the address listed on the bakery's tax form. It was a bleak, unremarkable neighborhood. The address belonged to a worn brick multi-use building. The upper floors were cramped residential apartments, and the ground floor housed a small, brightly lit family medical clinic. Julian stepped out of the black SUV, ignoring the umbrella his driver hastily offered. The cold rain soaked through his bespoke charcoal suit instantly, but he couldn't feel it. His heart was hammering against his ribs with a violent, erratic rhythm. He walked into the clinic to get out of the downpour and to find the building's directory. The waiting room smelled of sterile alcohol wipes, damp wool, and artificial cherry flavoring. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A mother was bouncing a fussy infant on her knee, while an elderly man read a crumpled newspaper in the corner. It was a world entirely foreign to the billionaire CEO. It was ordinary. It was a place where people worried about co-pays and bus schedules, not corporate mergers and offshore accounts. Julian approached the receptionist behind the sliding glass window. He was a towering, imposing figure in a ruined thousands-dollar suit, his face pale and drawn. The receptionist, a young woman in light blue scrubs, blinked up at him in surprise. "Excuse me," Julian said, his voice unusually raw. "I am looking for an Eleanor Vance. I believe she resides in the apartments above, or perhaps does consulting work for businesses in this building." The receptionist's brow furrowed. She glanced nervously at the computer screen. "I'm sorry, sir. Due to privacy policies, I can't confirm the residency or medical status of anyone in this building. Are you family? Bateman Dimmelbruy Imbershire Tats." "I am her husband," Julian said. The words tasted like a desperate prayer on his tongue. The receptionist looked skeptical. Before she could reply, the heavy wooden door leading to the examination rooms swung open.
"Thank you, Dr. Miller. I'll make sure he finishes the full course of the antibiotics this time," a voice said.
Julian's breath stopped. The air vanished from the room.
It was a voice he had heard in his dreams for over 1,000 agonizing nights. Warm, steady, with that slight melodic cadence that used to soothe the darkest corners of his mind.
He turned around slowly, his body moving as if submerged in deep water. Eleanor stood near the doorway. She was wearing faded denim jeans, a simple oversized gray sweater, and a pair of worn canvas sneakers. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a messy utilitarian clip. There were dark circles under her eyes, a testament to exhaustion and hard work. She had no designer jewelry, no flawless makeup. And yet to Julian, she had never looked more breathtakingly beautiful. But it wasn't just Eleanor. Balanced effortlessly on her left hip was a child. A boy no older than 2.5, wearing a bright yellow raincoat and clutching a small plastic toy car. Eleanor was looking down, adjusting the zipper of the boy's coat. "All right, little man, let's brave the rain," she murmured softly. Julian couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He was paralyzed by a shock so profound, it felt like a physical blow to the chest. He stared at the boy. The child stopped fidgeting with his toy car. As if sensing the heavy, suffocating weight of the stranger's stare, the boy turned his head and looked directly at Julian.
"Time fractured."
Julian stared into a face that he knew better than his own. The thick, unruly dark hair, the serious, calculating line of the tiny brow, and the eyes. Oh God, the eyes. They weren't hazel. They weren't brown or green. They were the exact piercing, stormy gray blue of the Sterling lineage. Julian felt the floor drop out from beneath him. A roaring sound rushed into his ears, drowning out the buzzing fluorescent lights and the rain beating against the windows. He had spent 3 years believing he was childless, mourning a marriage destroyed by a fake pregnancy. He had stared at Chloe's blonde, blue-eyed child and felt nothing but cold emptiness. But this boy, looking at this child was like looking into a mirror that reflected both his past and a future he didn't know he had lost. It was undeniable. It was absolute. The boy was a Sterling, his Sterling. Eleanor finally looked up. Her gaze swept across the waiting room and landed on the tall, soaked figure standing motionless near the reception desk. The warm maternal softness in her face vanished in a microsecond. The color drained completely from her cheeks, leaving her as pale as porcelain. Her eyes widened, a flash of pure, unadulterated panic tearing through her composure. Instinctively, violently, she pulled the boy tighter against her chest, stepping back so fast her shoulder hit the wooden doorframe with a dull thud. "Eleanor," Julian whispered. It wasn't a demand, it was a plea, a broken, shattered sound that barely made it past his lips. Eleanor didn't say a word. She looked at Julian, then down at her son, and then back at the man who had shattered her trust 3 years ago. The fierce, terrifying glare of a mother protecting her only child ignited in her hazel eyes. She turned around and bolted. Eleanor did not wait for the elevator. She knew Julian knew the ruthless, predatory speed he possessed when he wanted something. She bolted for the stairwell, her lungs burning as she took the concrete steps 2 at a time, her arms wrapped fiercely around Leo's small body. "Mama running." Leo said, his voice a mixture of confusion and excitement, thinking it was a sudden game. "Yes, baby, we are running." Eleanor gasped, her legs aching. The exhaustion of 3 years of single motherhood, of working late into the night and waking before dawn, weighed heavily on her bones. But a mother's terror provided an adrenaline that defied physical limits. She reached the second floor and sprinted down the narrow, dimly lit hallway toward her apartment. Her hands shook violently as she fumbled with her keys. She managed to unlock the deadbolt and shoved the door open, practically falling inside. She turned to slam the heavy door shut, but a large dress-shoed foot wedged into the frame. The impact shuddered up Eleanor's arms. She pushed against the wood with all her remaining strength, but she was fighting a man who was fighting for his life. Slowly, inevitably, the door was forced open. Julian stepped into the cramped apartment. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged movements. Rainwater dripped from his dark hair, trailing down the sharp angles of his face and soaking the collar of his ruined suit. He looked absolutely wrecked. He looked dangerous. Eleanor immediately backed away, putting herself solidly between Julian and her son. She set Leo down on the worn sofa, pushing him slightly behind her legs. "Get out," Eleanor commanded. Her voice was not a scream. It was a low, fierce hiss, vibrating with the protective rage of a woman who had built a safe fortress out of nothing and was watching it be invaded. "Get out of my home, Julian, or I swear to God I will call the police." Julian did not look at her. His gaze, wide and fractured, with a devastating mix of awe and agony, was locked entirely on the little boy peering out from behind Eleanor's jeans. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the small window and the ragged sound of Julian's breathing.
Julian started. He stopped swallowing hard. The smooth, commanding baritone of the Sterling Holdings CEO was completely gone. What came out was a fragile, cracked whisper. He, he has my eyes. He is my son," Eleanor said, her chin lifting defiantly. "His name is Leo, and he has nothing to do with you."
Julian finally tore his gaze away from the boy and looked at his wife. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the fading of her once vibrant complexion, the cheap fabric of her clothes. She looked endlessly tired. But beneath that exhaustion, she was made of titanium. She had walked away from a billionaire empire with nothing, choosing poverty over a lie, all to protect the child she was carrying. The realization hit Julian with the force of a freight train. "You were pregnant?" Julian breathed, his voice trembling as the pieces fell into place. The morning Chloe made her claim at the breakfast table. You were already carrying him. That is why you wouldn't fight. That is why you walked away so quickly."
"I walked away because you proved you could not be trusted," Eleanor corrected sharply, her eyes blazing with unshed tears. "You kept secrets, Julian. You allowed my sister to weaponize your silence. If I had stayed, my son would have been dragged into a media circus. He would have been subjected to DNA tests, to boardroom gossip, to a family that views children as assets to be managed. I refuse to let my child become collateral damage in your war."
Julian physically flinched as if she had struck him. He took a slow, unsteady step forward. Eleanor immediately mirrored him, taking a step back and spreading her arms slightly to shield Leo. "Eleanor, please," Julian begged. The sheer desperation in his tone was enough to shatter glass. Chloe lied. It was all a lie. The child wasn't mine. Richard Thorne paid her to fake the pregnancy to falsify the clinic records. He used her to distract me so he could win the European contract. Eleanor froze. Her breath hitched. The betrayal she had suspected for 3 years was finally given a name and a face. Her own sister had sold her out for a corporate payout. "I threw her out, Allah." Julian continued, his voice cracking, tears finally breaching the rim of his eyes. "I froze her accounts. I dismantled Thorne's company. I swear to you, I never touched her. I never stopped loving you. For 3 years, I have lived in a graveyard because I thought I lost you over my own arrogant silence." He looked back at the little boy on the sofa. Leo was watching the tall, crying man with wide, curious eyes. The boy wasn't afraid. He was simply analyzing his brow, furrowed in that exact heartbreakingly familiar Sterling expression. Julian's knees gave out. The billionaire who bowed to no one collapsed onto the cheap, scuffed linoleum floor. He knelt there, his massive frame shaking, the rainwater pooling around him. He looked up at Eleanor, his face entirely stripped of pride, leaving only a broken, starving man.
I am so sorry. Julian wept, the sound tearing from his throat in a ragged, agonizing sob. I was a fool. I thought I had to manage everything myself. I thought keeping the secret protected you. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. Please, please, Ale.
Eleanor looked down at the man kneeling on her floor. The anger that had fueled her for 3 years suddenly felt very heavy, very exhausting. She remembered the nights she had cried into her pillow, missing him. She remembered the fear of giving birth alone in a sterile hospital room, wishing his strong hand was holding hers. She had been strong for so long, she was so tired. Leo, sensing the shift in his mother's posture, peeked out completely from behind her legs. He looked at Julian, then took a tiny, hesitant step forward.
Leo, wait, Eleanor said softly, her voice wavering.
But Leo stopped just a foot away from Julian. He tilted his head. Man crying? The toddler asked his mother. Julian looked at his son. His hands resting on his thighs were trembling so violently he had to clench them into fists to stop the shaking. He slowly, painstakingly lifted his head to meet Eleanor's eyes, silently asking for permission. Eleanor closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She gave a small, barely perceptible nod. Julian reached out. His hand shook as it hovered in the air. He didn't grab the boy. He simply held his hand out, palm up, waiting. Leo looked at the hand, then stepped forward and placed his tiny warm fingers into Julian's large calloused palm. A sharp gas ripped from Julian's chest. The contact seemed to electrocute him. Gently, with a reverence reserved for handling fragile glass, Julian used his other hand to pull back the bright yellow hood of the boy's raincoat. He brushed aside the dark, soft hair at the nape of the boy's neck. There it was.
The small, faint crescent-shaped birthmark. The exact same mark that rested on the back of Julian's own neck. The undeniable proof of a lineage he thought had died. Oh God, Julian choked out, his face crumpled entirely. My son, my beautiful boy. He couldn't hold it back anymore. Julian pulled the toddler into his arms, burying his face in the small curve of the boy's shoulder. He wept openly, loudly, the sound of 3 years of accumulated grief, guilt, and overwhelming relief pouring out of him. He held his true heir, not as an asset, not as a corporate legacy, but as a starving man holding a lifeline.
Leo patted Julian's wet shoulder awkwardly. It's okay, the boy mumbled, reciting the words his mother always used when he scraped his knee. Eleanor covered her mouth with her hand, suppressing a sob of her own. She watched her husband break down, watched the impenetrable CEO dissolve into a father, meeting his child for the very first time. After a long time, Julian pulled back, wiping his face though the tears continued to fall. He looked up at Eleanor from the floor. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Julian said, his voice thick and raw. I know I lost the right to ask you to come home, but please, Eleanor, do not make me leave him. I will give you anything. I will sign over the entire company. I will give you my life. Just let me be his father. Let me try to be your husband again. Eleanor looked around the small apartment that had been her sanctuary. She looked at the ledgers on the table, the worn carpet, the reality of the hard life she had chosen. Then she looked at the two men on the floor, the halves of her heart that had finally collided. She took a slow, deep breath, feeling the titanium armor around her heart finally begin to lower. You can't buy your way back into this family, Julian, Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady and resolute. You can't fix this with a check or a contract. I know, he whispered. If you stay, Eleanor continued, her hazel eyes locking onto his stormy gray ones. There are no secrets. There are no shadows. We face the truth together, or you walk back out that door and you never return. Julian didn't hesitate. No secrets, never again. I swear it on his life and on mine. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The rain outside seemed to slow the harsh drumming, softening into a quiet rhythm. Then get up off the floor, Julian, she said softly, extending her hand toward him. Your son needs to eat lunch. Julian stared at her hand as if it were salvation itself. He took it, holding on as if he would never, ever let go. Forgiveness, Eleanor learned, was not a door you simply walk through. It was a bridge you had to build brick by heavy brick, over a chasm of broken trust. She did not pack her bags and fly back to the Manhattan penthouse that afternoon. She did not immediately slip the massive sterling diamond back onto her left hand. Eleanor demanded time, and for the first time in his life, Julian Sterling, a man who commanded global markets and dictated terms to world leaders, learned how to wait.
He didn't return to New York. Instead, the billionaire CEO bought the dilapidated apartment building in Seattle. He didn't evict anyone. He simply paid for new plumbing, upgraded the heating, and moved into the vacant apartment across the hall from Eleanor's.
For 6 months, Julian ran his multi-billion-dollar empire from a folding table in a cramped living room. But more importantly, he learned how to be a father. He learned how to assemble plastic toy tracks. He learned that Leo hated the crust on his toast. He learned to soothe a crying toddler at 2 in the morning without calling for a nanny. He stripped away the armor of the untouchable executive and became just Julian, a man desperately trying to earn the right to hold his family.
While Julian was building a bridge in Seattle, his legal team was laying waste to his enemies in New York.
Richard Thorne's empire crumbled with breathtaking speed. The evidence of corporate espionage, wire fraud, and falsified medical records was handed directly to federal prosecutors. Thorne Industries' stock plummeted to zero within a week. Richard Thorne was indicted on 22 counts of fraud and sentenced to a decade in federal prison, his legacy entirely erased from Wall Street. And Chloe learned the true cost of her ambition. Stripped of her offshore accounts and the luxurious townhouse, she was utterly abandoned by the high society she had worshipped. The scandal broke in the tabloids, branding her not as a victim, but as the architect of a malicious extortion plot. Unable to show her face in Manhattan, she fled to a small, obscure town in the Midwest. The last report Julian's security team received stated that she was working as a receptionist at a budget motel, living in a cramped rental, suffocating in the quiet, unremarkable life she had betrayed her own sister to escape. Her son Finn was being supported by a modest, anonymous trust Eleanor had insisted upon, because a child should never pay for the sins of the mother.
The villains had been vanquished not with explosive confrontations, but with the cold, absolute finality of justice.
A year after the rainy afternoon in Seattle, the morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling estate in New York.
It was a different house now. The sterile, museum like quality of the rooms had been replaced by life. There were colorful toys scattered on the Persian rugs. The priceless antique vases had been moved to higher shelves to make way for finger painted artwork taped proudly to the walls.
Eleanor stood in the doorway of the kitchen, leaning against the frame, holding a mug of warm tea. She was wearing a soft silk robe, her chestnut hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. The exhaustion that had haunted her eyes for 3 years was gone, replaced by a deep, radiant peace. She watched her husband. Julian, dressed in comfortable sweatpants and a simple t-shirt, was standing at the stove. The ruthless CEO was currently engaged in a high-stakes negotiation with a spatula and a pan of pancake batter. "More blueberries, Papa," Leo demanded, sitting at the kitchen island, kicking his feet happily. At 3 and a half, the boy was a whirlwind of energy, secure in a world where he was fiercely loved by both his parents. "More blueberries. Are you trying to bankrupt me, little man?" Julian teased, his deep voice rumbling with laughter. He tossed a handful of berries into the batter. "The Sterling Empire cannot sustain this level of fruit consumption." "Yes, it can," Leo stated with absolute serious confidence, his brow furrowing in that signature Sterling way. Julian stopped flipping the pancake and looked at his son. A soft, profound look of adoration crossed his sharp features. He leaned over the counter and kissed the top of Leo's dark hair. "You're right. For you, I'll buy the whole farm." Eleanor smiled, the warmth in her chest blooming like a springtime flower. She walked into the kitchen, setting her mug down. Julian turned, his eyes catching hers. Even after all this time, the way he looked at her like she was the only light in his universe made her breath catch. He set the spatula down and stepped into her space, wrapping his strong arms securely around her waist.
"Good morning, Mrs. Sterling," he murmured, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss against her lips.
"Good morning," Eleanor whispered back, resting her hands on his broad chest. She felt the steady, calm rhythm of his heart. "No secrets today?" Julian asked, his voice a gentle, private vow. It was a question he asked every single morning, a promise renewed daily. "No secrets." Eleanor confirmed, her hazel eyes shining with absolute trust. She reached up and gently traced the line of his jaw. "Just us." They sat down at the breakfast table together. It wasn't a sprawling mahogany table designed to keep people apart. It was a round, cozy oak table in the sunroom. There was no fine china, no silver spoons clinking ominously, just the chaotic, beautiful noise of a family. As Eleanor watched Leo laugh at a joke Julian made, she placed her hand over her husband's, their fingers intertwining naturally. She had walked through the fire. She had carried the weight of the world to protect her true heir. And in doing so, she had broken the curse of silence and forged a love that could never be shattered again. The storm was finally over, and the morning was absolutely beautiful.